you could start the recording. Great. Over to you, Tabitha.
Thank you so much. So I hope I can be heard clearly by everyone. So I'll begin. So in this session, we'll be tackling the Stockholm Convention. And
Tabby,
theme.
I think your voice is very faint. If you can speak a little louder.
Oh, okay. Let me just add further. Okay, what about right now?
Absolutely perfect.
Okay, okay. So in this session, we'll be tackling the Stockholm Convention, and the theme of this convention is to safeguard global health and the environment from persistent organic pollutants. So the first question that we'll then ask is, can anybody kindly share an example of a persistent organic pollutant that you're familiar with, or perhaps you've actually heard about? This is to also establish whether we actually know what this is, what persistent organic pollutants are, and their effects in the environment and all that. So if anybody has one example or anything that they know about persistent organic pollutants, you can speak, or perhaps you can even text in the chats. Okay.
I would like to think
Yes.
an example would be some compounds mainly manufactured of plastics like polyvinyl chloride and some others I'm not sure of. It's kind of technical, but that's one example, I think.
Yeah, thank you so much, Joshua. I think they can't fall under the persistent organic pollutants. Yes, you're very correct. And Henrietta also provides an example of methane, which could possibly include the pollutants which are organic in this matter. So I think we can proceed. So then, of course, the biggest question then becomes, what are POPs? So essentially, these are a class of toxic chemicals that, first of all, they resist breakdown in the environment, meaning that when they get to the environment, it's very hard to get rid of these things because then they live in the environment for such a long time, such that they become a menace, they become a problem. Secondly, they also accumulate in fatty tissues of living animals and humans. You see, POPs are normally found in mostly insecticides, pesticides. They're found in industrial chemicals, pharmaceuticals, and such kinds of materials that we use on a daily basis, right? A problem with that is, as we use them on our plants, because most of these things are used in agricultural premises, then we get to eat these animals, we get to eat these plants, and thus they get to our bodies. And that becomes a problem because then these chemicals are introduced into our bodies, and therefore they become a problem and a hazard to their human health, to animals' health, and they can actually cause cancers, they can cause heart attacks, they can even cause death, for crying out loud. So this is actually a really huge problem. Thirdly, they also increase in concentration. That is that they magnify up in the food chain, meaning that, of course, human beings are normally at the top of the food chain. So humans are the ones who are affected most. And from the producers up to the scavengers, they continue to be affected. And finally, is that they can migrate wide distances from the original sources. So a country that produces POPs, for example, let's say Canada is producing POPs, then these POPs will be directly affected, or rather other countries will feel the effects of these POPs because they tend to travel via wind or via air or via water. So it's very possible for these POPs to travel all the way to Antarctica, all the way to Arctic, states that never even produces these things, but they feel the effects of these chemicals. Yes, so examples of POPs, there are many, but I'll just give about 3 so that we get a clearer picture of what we are handling here. So first of all, we have DDTs. Of course, this is an agricultural or mosquito control insecticide, as I'd already said. And yeah, human health and ecological impacts exposed in the ritual calzones cell and spring. So it just affects human health and the environment, because then they tend to live for too long a time, such that we feel the effects of these things 12 years later, 20 years later. So it is a problem. Others are PCBs, which are commonly used in electric equipment, fluorescent lighting fixtures, building caulk, and the global PCB hotspots include the Arctic, where fatty tissues wildlife adapted for warmth also readily absorb PCBs. And I'd already said, these things tend to travel really fast and in ways in which cannot really be predicted, such that it will affect the Arctic, it will affect the Antarctica, and these are places which don't even produce the POPs in the first place. So thirdly, we also have dioxin, which is considered one of the most toxic chemicals known to science. So this is normally commonly produced from improper or incomplete burning of trash or municipal waste. I think we know this. I think this is one of the most common one that we know, but the kind of pollution that this kind of things produce is incredibly bad. It's just toxic in every way, right? Then yes, so then we also have another question. So how many of you have encountered or witnessed the negative impacts of chemical pollution in your local community? Take for instance, all the chemicals that we have given as an example, and all kinds of chemicals that perhaps you know, pesticides, insecticides, all kinds of chemicals, but you have actually felt its effects or their effects in your local community. It can be any, really. And as usual, you can also drop in the chat. You can also unmute yourself to answer this question. Yes, so Nivedita also says that, yeah, it does affect daily use vegetables, because as these things are being sprayed by these pesticides and insecticides, then they get to affect us directly as human beings, and it causes a lot of issues to our health. That's right. Another example, perhaps, before we continue.
Local runoff into streams from farmers using pesticides, like it's shown on the screen right now, it causes a lot of fish mortality, and also it also results in some harmful algal blooms as well.
Yes, that's very true, Joshua. So as he just said, it's true, it does affect marine life, it affects the fish, it affects animals, as well as, actually it affects every living creature on Earth. If you think about it, it affects the animals and plants alike. So eventually it causes a very high mortality rate. And so that kind of effect is very detrimental to our environment, to our health, to literally everything that we care and live for. So I think we can proceed. Yes, so then the Stockholm Convention then had to be formed to ensure that these POPs are controlled in a manner that is appropriate for each and every person on Earth. So it was first of all adopted in 2001 and entered into force in 2004. And currently it has been ratified by 182 countries, which is quite amazing, because then they get to implement these things into their national laws and it is legally binding. So first of all, one of the objectives is that it is made to eliminate or restrict the production of the use of Annex A POPs. Now, Annex A POPs are the most dangerous or the most toxic of chemicals that there are. Okay, we'll get into Annex A, Annex B, and Annex C kinds of chemicals. And secondly, the Stockholm Convention is also used to minimize the release of unintentional POPs in Annex C. We shall also get into what Annex C's chemicals are. Thirdly, capacity building, which is very important to enhance ability of countries to manage POPs, such that each and every country is able to deal with this menace And fourthly, information exchange, which is also very crucial on POPs and their alternatives, because not many people even know what POPs are. And perhaps if there are any alternatives to these toxic chemicals, then it will be better, because then it will reduce the kind of pollution and the kind of effects that these POPs have on every single thing, every single living creature. And fifthly, we have research and monitoring, which is of the POPs in humans and the global environment, because we need to see how it affects human beings. As already said, it causes a lot of health risks, and the global environment as well, how it affects every living creature, the plants, the animals, all kinds of things are found on Earth, and how they're directly affected, and how to actually mitigate those risks and those effects. So that is all from me from the Stockholm Convention. I shall pass the mantle to Shannon. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tabitha, for a great overview. And then Tabitha just mentioned, while going over the key objectives of Stockholm, that there are different annexes of chemical substances in the convention. So what are these annexes, and what's the purpose of the 3 different annexes we've listed here on your screen? So Annex A, B, and C of the Stockholm Convention each reflect different degrees of regulation or restriction that the parties to the Stockholm Convention are obligated to once a specific chemical or class of chemicals, because it's not always an individual chemical, as we're seeing recently with the progress, albeit slow, being made with PFAS forever chemicals. Currently, that class of chemicals is listed in Annex B. And there's further guidance to come from Stockholm as to the specific species of those PFAS chemicals that are regulated and controlled. So you'll also see that within these annexes, individual chemicals or classes of chemicals, especially those really large classes of chemicals that we might not know just how many different forms there currently are, based on the progress of science and ability to measure them. So again, parties to the convention, once a chemical or class of chemicals is added to one of these annexes, that party is obligated to take certain action to, based on the annex it's listed in, either eliminate, restrict, or reduce unintentional releases. So Annex A, as Tabitha gave us an introduction to, requires that parties take measures to completely eliminate the production and use of such chemicals. Annex B requires parties to take measures to restrict their production and use, so to limit and minimize, even if they cannot be completely eliminated at this current point in time. And Annex C is where parties must take measures to reduce unintentional releases. So Annex C, some of the chemicals listed there include dioxins that may be unintentionally released from burning, for example, of e-waste. Joshua gave a good example with PVC earlier, and how it falls within the realm of the Stockholm Convention. Dioxins and furans, 2 widespread POPs, are commonly released from the burning of e-waste and other municipal and household waste. Also PCBs that are currently widespread in electrical equipment like transformers and capacitors. The world is only beginning in many areas to start to move away from PCBs. So, there's specific control measures for those in Annex C to reduce unintentional releases from capacitors and transformers. And maybe it's worth mentioning here too, if we go back a few slides, one of these pictures here while Tabitha was speaking is not just a picture pulled off of line. This is actually a site that our nonprofit is working on here in New Jersey, and it is a severe POP site involving capacitors that were crushed over time and mixed in the soil. And the US Government Environmental Protection Agency has estimated that without intervention and reduction of the source, that it could continue to contaminate water bodies in the areas for decades, if not centuries. So that just goes to show how long POPs last in the environment and as they move through the food chain. You could see that there's signs posted warning, fishermen and communities to not only limit their consumption of fish, but to not even eat one single organism from the water bodies around this site. So that just goes to show just how severe POPs can be for local communities and in the environments. Again, Annex C, part of the process for determining on which list a specific chemical will go on, of course, is based on that chemical's properties in the environment. So is it a POP? How does it migrate and move through the environment? How does it move through the food chain? What toxicity does it have on wildlife, including sensitive and endangered populations? So this is where, really the key links to, the Biodiversity Convention comes in as well, and also its toxicity to human health. But the listing is also based on just feasibility in the current time and the current state of our supply chain and technical capabilities to measure and find alternatives of how we can remove or reduce them in the supply chain. So kind of weighing a risk versus benefit based on what we know in science and the alternatives that exist. For example, DDT at the moment is not currently on Annex A to completely eliminate DDT, because for many countries, DDT is critical in the arsenal to reduce malaria and control mosquito populations, even though it's such a highly toxic pesticide. So this just opens the call for, progress in science to be made, progress towards a circular economy. If anybody is interested in, chemistry and engineering, this is a really great area to get into, because the world, is learning more about the hazards of chemicals that have been used now and in the past. And there's a big push to find alternatives for those chemicals, that still maintain, for example, in the case of pesticides, that really help control disease spread that is ever rising with climate change, particularly in certain regions. How do we control mosquito populations and disease spread while also not harming local communities to toxic chemicals that are sprayed? So that is such a critical question, as we enter the call for a circular economy era. So looking at how chemicals are listed on any one of these annexes, or at times not listed, chemicals can be proposed for listing by any party to the Stockholm Convention. So any country that is a party to Stockholm can propose a listing of a new chemical. And once proposed, a POP's review committee, so this is similar if you had watched our Rotterdam session, it's very similar to the Rotterdam Chemical Review Committee process. And in this case, it's a POPs review committee that assesses that proposal and makes recommendations as to, whether such a chemical should be listed and can be listed under the Stockholm Convention, and what annex such a chemical, is recommended to be listed to. Then that proposal and those recommendations get taken to a plenary, which is at the Conference of the Parties, which we just had, and I just returned from and am settling back into my time zone. So thanks for bearing with me on that. But every 2 years at the Conferences of the Parties of BRS, so Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm, the plenary votes on certain measures, under each of those conventions. Each convention gets its own session, and for Stockholm, at least 75% of the vote is required for listing if consensus can't be achieved. They always try to aim to achieve consensus first, but if not, 3/4 majority vote for that chemical to be listed in one of the annexes. And again, the votes happen during plenary at the COPs, which occur every 2 years. There's a link here, and I hope it works, to share with you. Here we go. Hopefully you can see that. Just as a quick overview as to some of the chemicals currently listed in the Stockholm Convention, you could see Annex A currently has the most chemicals listed for elimination. That includes, like I mentioned, PFAS and PFOA. PCBs are also on there. You also see PCBs in Annex C because they're still very common in capacitors. So this is a big one to control, preventing those capacitors from, once they reach their end of life, from just being haphazardly disposed of in the environment and crushed in those PCBs to be released. And you'll see again here, DDT is on Annex B, aiming to restrict use of DDT. But again, in many areas, pesticides like this are, an integral part of mosquito and other pest control and disease control. So, that's why DDT in part is on Annex B for restriction and not necessarily currently on Annex A for elimination, but hopefully it will make it there, soon in the years to come as we find healthier alternatives. In terms of this last round of the BRS COPs, which just wrapped up last week, under the Stockholm Convention, there were 3 new chemicals that were listed in Annex A. So for elimination of production and use, one of those was methoxychlor, which is a pesticide. This is actually was a replacement for DDT and also found to be highly toxic. So again, this is why as we move into different chemical alternatives and as more and more chemicals are produced around the world, it's so critical that they are tested for their impacts on the environment and human health before they're put into use. 2 other chemicals also listed this last round of COPs were dichlorine plus, that's a flame retardant, and then UV 328. This is a UV filter used in plastics. So again, here's a clear link with the Stockholm Convention and then also the upcoming INC plastic treaty negotiations. A lot of the times the processes at BRS and the other chemicals processes, including SciCam, end up feeding into now our development of the global plastics treaty, because plastics isn't just a solid waste problem, it's a hazardous chemical problem as well. So moving along here, here's another kind of audience question we have as we move along, wrapping up our presentation. Have you come across any initiatives or actions taken by your country or community to address the issue of POPs? We'd love to hear that in the chats. Just to get, more of a regional overview, it'd be great to see what's happening across the different regions and countries that you know of for the regulation and control of POPs. So please be welcome to share that in the chat. And for sake of time, while you do that, I'd just like to quickly go through and give you a little bit of a briefing here on some of the outcomes of this most recent BRS COPs, specifically on the Stockholm Convention, which was COP 11. So along with the listing of those 3 chemicals that I mentioned in Annex A, there was also the presentation by the BRS Secretariat of the 3rd Global Monitoring Report. And this is again, the 3rd iteration of this sort of global assessment on POPs. It shares scientific and technical knowledge as to what we know about POPs in our environment and also in humans and human tissue. But it also gives a great look at how well the Stockholm Convention has been performing, over time since it was adopted and entered into force in 2004. How are actual real conditions on the ground, changing from, in part decisions that are made by countries via the Stockholm Convention. So this gives a good look at, when we're looking at environmental laws, it could be very easy to just see them as words on a page, and how does it actually impact me in my community, when I'm not in the negotiation room. So this has been a great resource to see those trends. Monitoring data is shown to be improving across the world, including in regions where there was previously very limited monitoring data. So there's more data on soil, water, air, fish, other animals and humans being collected around the world, which is great because we don't just want a global north centric view of this. We want to see how this is impacting regions and communities around the world. But there's still, of course, spatial gaps that exist where there's certain areas that really haven't been adequately covered with data collection yet. And also some technical gaps that need to be filled. For example, not all countries and communities necessarily have the latest state-of-the-art laboratory technology or measurement techniques to be able to have kind of that level of consistency in measurement that maybe some other countries do. So at times, samples, if they are collected from one country, perhaps they need to be shipped, to another country to be analyzed. And there's, of course, all new technical considerations that go into that with preserving data quality. The report also showed that POP concentrations, this is a big win, are generally declining in both the environment and in humans. So human breast milk, human tissues, but there are some limitations as to data for the more recent chemicals listed, and that's understandable because we don't necessarily have as wide a body of data to review and look for trends with the more recent chemicals listed. Some chemicals are also seeing an increasing trend. While there's a general decline of POPs in the environment, there's some specific types of chemicals that were noted to see an increasing trend. And part of that was proposed in the report can be due from secondary sources, and also perhaps climate change effects as well, with increasing migration of POPs, and also the release, as we're seeing, there's a release of historical and legacy POPs that have once been held in ice, and as that ice is melting, those now are released into the environment. So that's where those secondary sources come in. And then kind of the third major point here from this report is that, while we're seeing POPs generally decline, of course, because of their persistence in the environment, the fact that they resist breakdown, as I mentioned earlier, there's real sites where POPs are found where it has been, noted that without an intervention, they will continue to be released into soil and water at these sites for decades, if not centuries. And because of how highly toxic they are at very low levels, the concentrations that exist in the environments still remain of concern, even though we're seeing those declines. So, great win on progress being made, but in no way are we, just waving goodbye to POPs yet. There's still a lot more work to be done. And then another big win at Stockholm, just to briefly mention this and cover it, we will, of course, be covering this in more detail on the Chemicals Waste Youth Platform side in a upcoming debrief we'll have on the BRS COPs. But big major accomplishment at Stockholm was finally a compliance mechanism was adopted. And this is after about 18 years of these conferences of the parties where there was a mandate that existed to have a compliance mechanism to track and review, the status of different parties and meeting their obligations of the convention. But a compliance mechanism could not be agreed to by parties until this most recent COP. So this is, a huge step in the right direction, and it'll be really great to see the progress made in developing and implementing that compliance mechanism. And the intention is for this to be operated by another committee, so a compliance committee that will review and oversee, and also, not just being there to point fingers and, tell parties that they're not meeting their obligations or they're doing something wrong, but to also support parties in meeting obligations under the convention. So that's where, capacity building and resources, knowledge sharing come into play here. Okay, so, and just to bring it back to relevant for, us as young people on this call, which you might be asking, how does this, really affect me and my community? Maybe I didn't attend or follow the BRS COPs, or I'm just getting into chemicals. How is this a me issue? So we know very well, especially if you've seen some of our earlier sessions, we kind of shout this from the rooftops because it is so critically important that children and youth experience heightened, so more severe, and also unique vulnerabilities to environmental degradation, which includes hazardous chemicals and waste. And we use the word unique vulnerabilities because it's not just more severe impact, but there's also key windows of development that babies, infants, children, adolescents, and then even after age 18, when the brain is still developing, where exposures can be particularly harmful, and those developmental windows just aren't present in older adults. And despite the general awareness of this more severe risk, specific routes of exposure and health impacts to children and adolescents have only really been evaluated intensively for a very, very small portion of chemicals. There's still a lot of POPs on the list, even under the Stockholm Convention, that we know are toxic, hazardous to humans, linked to cancer, but the full suite of effects to children and young people still remain to be evaluated. So there's definitely going to be a lot more that we learn as science further develops there. And it's also on us to raise the political priority of chemicals so that funding goes towards assessing these chemicals, that it is prioritized, just as climate change and biodiversity are. So again, we're living in this pretty disturbing point in time where newborns are entering the world, quote, pre-polluted. This is a term that the Special Rapporteur on Toxics and Human Rights has used in his reports. So starting out a life carrying a toxic chemical load, especially relevant with POPs, because again, POPs are known to be transferred through breast milk, through the umbilical cord. So before a newborn baby even interacts with their environments, we're seeing a lot of cases of generations of young people being born pre-polluted. So this goes beyond just a transboundary issue, so an issue between countries, but it's also a transgenerational issue. So damage that can be carried across different generations of people. And that's why this is such a critical issue for us as young people. And to kind of wrap up here, and happy to take any questions also you have, but just to as a next step, so the Chemicals and Waste Youth Platform, of which both me and Tabitha are a part of. Tabitha is our Chemicals and Human Rights thematic focal point. We're going to be having a 2023 BRS COPS debrief to share more about what happened these past few weeks at the BRS COPS in Geneva, and what are those next steps, and also to do a constituency call. So that will be on 28th May 2023 at 1400 UTC. And then also there's a link here to our Chemicals Waste Youth Platform discussion group if you're interested, and I could also copy this over into the chat. But thank you so much for your time and attention on the Stockholm Convention. I hope we gave you a few things to think about, and including those questions that we shared during our presentation. We would love to hear more about those if you join on our constituency call. And a huge thank you to the Environmental Law Working Group of CYMG for convening this series of sessions. And if Stockholm and several of the other sessions that Chemicals and Waste Youth Platform presented interested you, I hope you will continue to follow their series, which is continuing into June. So thank you so much, Joshua and Santhia, and open for questions or back to you, Santh and Josh. Thanks so much.